I didn't find out the truth the moment I saw the messages. Not when I found the bank statement. I found it the second Claire looked at me across the kitchen table and didn't blink. That's the look of someone who decided, a long time ago, that you don't deserve the truth. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old. I work as a senior project engineer at a mid-sized construction firm. I manage timelines, calculate load tolerances, walk job sites in boots that never come entirely clean. My entire professional life is built around one skill: understanding how things are structured from the inside. Walls, foundations, load-bearing systems. You learn to read a building the way some people read faces. You look for the cracks that haven't opened yet. I missed every single crack in my own house. Claire and I had been married for 11 years. We met when we were both 26. She was finishing a master's degree in interior design. I was 2 years into my first real job. We married young by the standards of our circle, moved into a small apartment in the north part of the city, and built everything slowly, the way people who don't come from money tend to do. By the time our daughter Mia was born, she's 9 now, we had saved enough for a down payment on the house we still live in. A 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with a maple tree in the front yard that turns violent orange every October. We were, by every external measure, fine. Claire ran a small interior design practice from a home office. She had 3 or 4 steady clients at any given time, handled her own invoicing, managed her own schedule. I respected that about her. She was organized, methodical, and she handled money carefully, or so I believed. We kept a joint account for household expenses and separate personal accounts for our individual incomes. It had been her suggestion when we married, and it made sense. We were 2 adults with careers. We trusted each other. That word, trusted. The first thing I noticed, the thing I didn't notice noticing, was a Saturday morning in late February. I came downstairs at 7, earlier than usual, and found Claire already at the kitchen table with her laptop open. Not unusual. She sometimes worked on weekends when a project deadline was close. But she closed the laptop when she heard my footsteps on the stairs. Slowly, without hurry, the way you close something when you don't want to appear to be hiding it. I poured coffee. I asked if she wanted a cup. "Already have one," she said and smiled. I told myself I hadn't seen anything. And for 6 more weeks I almost believed it. March arrived cold and gray. The kind of month that feels like a waiting room between seasons. Mia had a school project on ecosystems that consumed 3 consecutive evenings, and Claire helped her build a diorama of a wetland out of cardboard, cotton balls, and green paint, watching them work at the dining table. Mia's tongue pressed to her lip in concentration, Claire patiently trimming pieces of artificial moss. I felt something I can only describe as gratitude. The steady, quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. Life, in other words, looked entirely normal. But normal, I was beginning to understand, is sometimes a performance given by someone with a great deal of practice. The renovation had been Claire's idea, which in itself meant nothing. The house needed work. The downstairs bathroom had original 1990s plumbing that had been groaning since winter, and the kitchen backsplash was a beige tile pattern that we'd always meant to replace. Claire had been talking about it since the previous autumn. In March, she brought home a folder of material samples and quotes, spread them across the coffee table, and walked me through her vision. New tile, new fixtures in the bathroom, possibly a small rework of the kitchen layout. Reasonable. Professional. She had vendor contacts through her design work and said she could manage the project herself, which would save us the general contractor markup. I said it sounded good. I said I trusted her judgment. She suggested we pull the money from our joint savings. We had roughly $42,000 in there, accumulated over years of careful spending, and run the renovation budget through a separate account she would manage. It would keep things cleaner, she said, easier to track. She'd give me weekly updates. I said that made sense. I said I trusted her. The contractor she hired was a man named Greg. I met him once, briefly, when he came to assess the bathroom. He was in his mid-40s, heavy-set, with a firm handshake and the faint smell of sawdust and cigarette smoke that clings to men who work with their hands. He seemed competent. Claire spoke to him with the comfortable shorthand of 2 professionals who had worked together before, and I assumed they had. She'd mentioned using tradespeople she trusted from past client projects. The work began in early April. The bathroom was gutted. There was dust on every surface for 2 weeks, a portable toilet in the backyard that Mia found hilarious, and the constant background percussion of someone hammering something somewhere in the walls. Renovation sounds. They became white noise. What I noticed in those weeks were smaller things. Claire's phone, which she had always left face up on the counter or the nightstand, now lived face down. Always. On every surface. I told myself she'd probably changed a setting or was trying to reduce screen time. She'd mentioned that idea once. I told myself it meant nothing. She started going to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She had never gone to the gym consistently in the 11 years I'd known her. I mentioned this once lightly, and she said her friend Dana had convinced her to try a new class, some kind of reformer Pilates thing that was impossible to get into. She seemed happy about it. She came home slightly flushed, which is what people look like after exercise, and showered immediately, which is what people do. I noticed that she never mentioned anything specific about the class. The instructor's name. A funny thing that happened. The type of detail that fills ordinary conversation when you've actually been somewhere. I noticed. I filed it away. I did nothing with it. There was one evening in mid-April, a Wednesday. I remember because I'd had a brutal site inspection that day and came home later than planned. When I walked through the back door and heard Claire's voice from the hallway, she was on the phone, speaking quietly but with an urgency that made me pause. Not the words, I couldn't make them out, but the tone. The intimate, lowered register of a conversation you don't want overheard. She heard me come in. The voice stopped. She appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later, phone already pocketed, and said, "Dana, she's having drama with her landlord again." I said and opened the refrigerator. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at its contents without seeing them, feeling something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself a lot of things. That night, after Mia was in bed and Claire was in the shower, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the renovation folder she'd left there. Receipts, material invoices, a handwritten schedule. Everything looked orderly. Plumbing supplies, tile samples, a deposit receipt for the contractor. I closed the folder. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep for a long time. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle, and I thought about the way Claire had closed her laptop that February morning. The slow, deliberate click of it. The smile that followed. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know. It was Mia who gave me the first real thread to pull, though she didn't know it. We were driving home from her Saturday soccer practice in late April. A routine I handled every week, 40 minutes round trip, juice boxes in the cup holder. When she said, from the back seat, "Dad, is our house getting a new kitchen because of Greg's apartment?" I kept my eyes on the road. "What do you think, buddy?" Mom was talking on the phone and said something about Greg's apartment needing money. She paused, considering. Or maybe it was Greg's landlord. "I don't really know." I said, "Maybe. I'm not sure." My voice came out level. I thought about that for 3 days. In early May, I started paying closer attention to the renovation account. Claire had set it up at our regular bank and added me as a secondary holder. Another thing that, in isolation, looked like transparency. I hadn't been checking it closely. My own project workload was heavy that spring, and I had trusted the weekly updates she gave me over dinner, which were brief and competent. Tile is in, plumbing rough and done, backsplash scheduled for next week. I logged in one Thursday night while Claire was putting Mia to bed. The account balance was $6,200. We had transferred $28,000 into it in March. The bathroom renovation, new fixtures, tile, labor, should have cost somewhere between $9,000 and $13,000, based on Claire's initial estimate. The kitchen backsplash, another 3 to 4. Call it $18,000 total with a generous buffer. $28,000 minus $18,000 should leave roughly $10,000. There was $6,200. I sat very still in my home office with the laptop screen casting blue light across my hands and tried to find the explanation that made sense. Maybe she'd paid ahead for the kitchen. Maybe there were costs I hadn't been told about. Maybe the plumbing had been worse than expected. That happens in old houses. I knew that professionally. Surprises behind walls. I went to bed without saying anything. I needed to see the transaction history first. The next morning, I woke early, before Claire, and sat in the kitchen with my coffee and pulled up the full statement on my phone. The transaction history was long. There were legitimate entries, payments to a tile supplier I recognized, a plumbing fixture company, 2 payments to a contracting service that matched what Greg had quoted. But there were other entries that stopped me cold. 6 transfers to an account I didn't recognize, each between $800 and $1,400. The first one in late March. The most recent, 4 days ago. Total, just under $7,000. The account number meant nothing to me. The transfers were listed simply as personal transfer, with a reference number. I screenshot every entry. I put my phone down. I picked up my coffee and drank it while staring at the maple tree in the front yard, whose branches were just beginning to leaf out after a long winter. Small, bright green leaves. New things. When Claire came downstairs, I was reading the news on my tablet, and I said good morning, and she kissed the top of my head, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and dish soap and the faint chemical tang of the new grout in the bathroom. I smiled at her. I had never in my life felt so alone in a room with another person. Over the next 2 weeks, I investigated carefully the way I approach a structural problem at work. Gather information before forming conclusions. Don't assume. Don't telegraph. I called our bank under the guise of a question about joint account permissions and managed to confirm, without revealing why I was asking, that the destination account was a personal account at the same bank. Not a business account, not a contractor payment system. I reached out to the tile supplier whose name appeared on our statements. I said I was following up on our project invoice for record-keeping purposes. The woman I spoke to was helpful. The total they'd invoiced us for was $3,100. What appeared in our statement was $3,100. I called the plumbing fixture company. Same exercise. Their invoice matched exactly. The $7,000 had gone somewhere else entirely. And it had gone there in 6 separate, carefully spaced transfers. The kind of spacing that looks, to anyone glancing at a statement, like ordinary household outflow. I thought about Greg. About the way Claire had spoken to him with that professional ease. About Mia's offhand comment in the car, Greg's apartment needing money. I thought about the gym sessions that produced no stories. I thought about the phone always face down. I built a quiet, careful picture. And the more tiles I placed, the less I wanted to see what it was becoming. I want to be honest about what it feels like to investigate your own marriage. It doesn't feel like a detective story. It doesn't feel purposeful or dramatic. It feels like standing in a house you've lived in for years and noticing, for the first time, that one of the walls is hollow. You knock on it. You hear the echo. And then you have to decide whether you want to know what's on the other side, because whatever it is, once you know, you cannot unknow it. I decided I needed to know. I took a day off work on a Thursday in mid-May and told Claire I was heading to a site inspection 2 hours away. A routine trip, nothing unusual. I kissed her goodbye. I drove 6 blocks, parked on a side street, and waited. At 9:40 in the morning, a gray Honda pulled up in front of our house. Claire came out the front door 12 minutes later. She was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, dark green, fitted, the kind of thing she wore to client meetings, not to a contractor site visit. She had a small overnight bag over one shoulder. An overnight bag. I followed the Honda at a careful distance for 25 minutes. It pulled into the parking lot of a mid-range hotel on the western edge of the city. The Ashford Suites, a business hotel near the convention center that I had driven past 100 times without ever registering. Parked. I watched Claire and the driver, a man, dark-haired, trim, not Greg, walk into the lobby together. She was laughing at something he'd said. The kind of laugh that belongs to a different life than the one I was looking at from a parking lot with my hands clenched around a steering wheel. I sat there for a long time. Then I drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat in a corner booth and stared at a cup of black coffee until it went cold. This was not Greg. The man was younger, perhaps early 30s, with a studied, slightly artful appearance. The kind of person who chooses their clothes deliberately. I had never seen him before. I began to reassemble everything. The transfers weren't to a contractor. They weren't to Greg. They were to this man or to something connected to him. The renovation had been, at least partly, a financial cover story. Real enough to be credible, structured carefully enough that a busy husband glancing at a bank statement would see tile invoices and plumbing receipts and feel satisfied. She had used the renovation as a delivery system for money she was funneling elsewhere. The question was, how much and for how long? Over the following week, I went back further through our joint finances, as far back as I could access online, 18 months. I found nothing unusual before February, which meant this had started around the same time as the renovation planning. The renovation had not been a coincidence. It had been the vehicle. I also found something I hadn't expected. Our joint savings account, the one we'd been building for years, now sitting at roughly $42,000 before the renovation transfer, had had an additional withdrawal in January, $4,500. The memo field read, home maintenance, HVAC inspection, and pre-season service. We had not had any HVAC work done in January. I had been home every weekend that month. No technician had ever come to our house. So it hadn't started with the renovation. The renovation had been an escalation. I didn't confront her that week. I knew, professionally, personally, that a confrontation without complete information is a negotiation you'll lose. I needed to know who this man was. His name took me 4 days to find. I used the only lead I had, the partial license plate I'd managed to note in the hotel parking lot. I have a contact, a former colleague who now works in insurance investigation who owed me a favor. I'm not proud of how I used it. He came back with a name and an address within 48 hours. Marcus, 32 years old. Listed occupation, freelance creative consultant. An address in a neighborhood on the east side of the city that had been gentrifying for the past 5 years. Converted lofts, coffee shops, the kind of street where a ground-floor apartment rents for more than it should. I drove past the building once, on a Sunday afternoon, while Claire was at the farmer's market with Mia. It was a clean, renovated brick building, newer windows, a small coffee bar on the ground floor. I thought of the $7,000. I thought of the $4,500. I thought about what a freelance creative consultant's rent might look like in that building, and whether $11,500 over 5 months would cover a portion of it. I thought about Claire managing our renovation budget with the same methodical care she'd always applied to client projects. Materials sourced, invoices tracked, costs justified. Except this time the project was something else entirely. I went home. Mia had saved me a peach from the market, placed carefully on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that said Dad in her large, earnest handwriting. I stood in the kitchen and held the peach and felt the specific grief of a man who understands, finally and completely, that the life he thought he was living has a different blueprint than the one he was handed. I waited until Mia was at my mother's for the weekend, a planned visit that had been on the calendar for 3 weeks. I didn't manufacture the timing. I simply waited for it. It was a Saturday evening in early June. We'd eaten dinner. The kitchen was clean. The new backsplash tile was in pale gray herringbone, genuinely beautiful, the kind of thing Claire has always been good at. I'd always told her she had real talent. I sat down across from her at the dining table and put my phone between us, screen up, with the bank statement pulled open. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. I found the transfers, I said. 6 of them. About $7,000 total. They didn't go to any contractor. A pause. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on. I can explain. I also found the January withdrawal, I said. The one listed as HVAC service. We didn't have any HVAC service in January. She was quiet. And I followed you, I said. Cost me something to say it out loud. 3 weeks ago, I saw you go to the Ashford Suites. I saw who you went with. Her expression didn't collapse the way I'd half expected. It shifted, some calcified layer of performance cracking, slowly, the way old plaster cracks when the house settles. Not dramatic, just structural. How long? I asked. She looked at her hands. 8 months. 8 months. Mia had started 3rd grade 8 months ago. We'd gone apple picking as a family 8 months ago. I'd made chili from scratch for the first time in years 8 months ago. And Claire had said it was the best thing I'd ever cooked. And the money. She nodded very slightly. Tell me. What came out over the next hour was not a confession so much as a gradual dismantling. Claire spoke slowly, in the careful, precise way she speaks when she's managing a difficult client conversation. Measured, controlled, giving information in segments rather than all at once. I recognized the technique. I'd watched her use it professionally for years. Marcus, she said, was someone she had met at a design conference the previous autumn. He was a creative director at a branding agency, not, it turned out, a freelance consultant, which suggested he'd described himself differently to different people. They had stayed in contact. It had become something else. The money, and here her voice became quieter, more careful, had been his idea originally. Not in a transactional way, she said, as though the distinction mattered. He'd been going through a difficult period. A gap between contracts. She had helped him with rent twice in the beginning before the renovation. And then the renovation had provided cover. How much total? I asked. She hesitated. Claire. Close to 15,000. The number settled over the room like a change in air pressure. $15,000. Accumulated in an 11-year marriage in small transfers from a shared savings account, while our daughter slept upstairs and I read site reports in my home office and believed, because I had been given every reason to believe, that the money was going toward tile and pipes. I looked at her across the table, the woman I had married, the mother of my daughter, the person whose handwriting I could identify from across a room, who took her coffee with oat milk, who always cried at the same moment in the same movie we'd watched together a dozen times. Did you love him? I asked. She looked at me for a long time before answering. I don't know what it was, she said finally. Did he know you were married? Yes. Did he know about Mia? Her jaw tightened fractionally. Yes. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I stood at the new backsplash, her beautiful, careful work, and pressed one hand flat against the cold tile and breathed. Then I turned around. I want you to leave tonight, I said. Not permanently. I don't know what permanently looks like yet. But I need you to go somewhere else tonight. She didn't argue. She went upstairs. I heard her moving quietly above me for 20 minutes. Then the sound of her rolling a suitcase across the hardwood. Then the front door. I sat alone in a house that suddenly felt like a building I'd never properly surveyed. All the things I'd thought were solid. All the weight-bearing structures I'd assumed were sound. I sat there until midnight. Then I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Mia's empty room. Her soccer cleats on the floor, the half-finished wetland diorama still on her desk, and I felt the particular weight of being a parent who is about to have to explain something to a child who doesn't yet know the world is capable of this. I didn't cry. Not that night. But I sat on the edge of Mia's bed in the dark for a long time, and I thought about foundations. About how a building can look perfectly intact while something essential has been compromised inside the wall. About how the job sometimes isn't repair. Sometimes the job is understanding what you're actually dealing with. The weeks that followed were the quietest of my adult life. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind, the quiet of a space that used to be full of sound. I dropped Mia at my mother's while Claire and I began the first of what would become many conversations with a mediator and, separately, a lawyer. I told Mia that Mom and Dad were working through something difficult, that she hadn't done anything wrong, and that she would always know where both her parents were. She was 9 and she was smart and she cried, and then she asked if she could bring her diorama to Grandma's house. I said yes. Of course yes. Claire and I didn't reconcile. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a pressure in these stories to find a redemptive pivot, the couple who worked through it who came out stronger. We did not. What we found, over the course of 3 months of mediation and a great deal of quiet, painful conversation, was something more modest. A reasonable account of what had happened and a functional framework for raising our daughter in 2 households. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was real. Financially, the picture was complicated. The $15,000 was documented across the statements I had carefully saved. My attorney advised me that in the context of our divorce proceedings, the deliberate misrepresentation and diversion of marital funds would be a relevant factor. Claire did not contest this. We reached an agreement that adjusted the asset division accordingly. Marcus, as far as I know, continued his life undisrupted. I thought about that for a while, about the asymmetry of it, the way a person can participate in the destruction of another person's life and bear no structural consequence. I spent some time being angry about it. Then I spent less time being angry about it. It wasn't resolution exactly. It was more like accepting that some accounts don't balance. What I found harder to accept, and this took longer, was my own part in it. Not the betrayal. That was Claire's choice, entirely and without qualification. But the willful blindness I had cultivated. The February morning when she closed the laptop and I decided not to ask. The evenings when her voice went quiet and I chose not to follow the sound. The bank statements I glanced at without reading. I had trusted her in the specific way that convenient faith works. Not as a considered position, but as an abdication. Trusting someone because examining things too closely feels like an accusation. Trusting someone because the alternative, that something is genuinely wrong, is more frightening than ignorance. I am a man whose job is to find structural problems before they become structural failures. I spent 11 years applying that skill to concrete and steel and wood, and practically none of it to the place where it might have mattered most. I don't say this to punish myself. I say it because it is true, and because the only useful thing I found in any of this was a sharper, clearer version of my own perception. I no longer look away from things I notice. I no longer file observations under probably nothing and move on. By autumn, Mia had settled into a routine between two households with the elastic adaptability of children who are loved and told the truth in age-appropriate portions. She still plays soccer on Saturdays. I still drive her and we still stop for juice boxes, and she still talks about whatever is consuming her attention that week. Her friend Lily's new puppy, a chapter book she's reading, the particular injustice of a substitute teacher who gave too much homework. One Saturday in October, the maple tree in the front yard turned orange. The deep, violent orange it turns every year without fail, regardless of what happens in the house beneath it. I stood on the porch in the morning with a cup of coffee and looked at it for a long time. I thought about the $4,500 that left our account in January while I stood at the window of our bedroom and looked at the street below, not noticing. I thought about the hotel parking lot, the green dress, the small overnight bag. I thought about Mia's peach on the counter with its handwritten note. I thought about how a house can look completely intact from the outside. Then I went inside. I had things to do. Mia was coming for the weekend, and she'd asked me to try making chili again, the good kind, from scratch, the kind I'd made once 3 years ago that everyone had loved. I got out the pot. I started from the beginning. What this story is really about isn't infidelity. It's about the architecture of denial, and how a person can be structurally trained to miss exactly what they most need to see. Daniel's story follows a pattern that will feel familiar to anyone who has ever chosen comfort over clarity. From the very first moment, Claire closing the laptop, slowly, without alarm, the warning signs were present. But Daniel processed each one through a filter of reasonable explanation. The gym with no stories. The phone always face down. The quiet phone call that ended too quickly. Each individual signal was deniable. Cumulatively, they formed something unmistakable. And yet he looked away. At what point would you have started to doubt? That's the question worth sitting with. Because for Daniel, the doubt was there. He tells us he couldn't sleep that night, that something cold had settled in his chest. The doubt wasn't absent. It was actively managed. He didn't lack perception, he suppressed it. There's a specific emotional mechanism at work here. The fear that asking the right question will destroy something you still want to believe in. So you don't ask. What makes Claire's deception particularly methodical, and particularly damaging, is that it was financial before it was emotional. The HVAC withdrawal in January predates the renovation plan. She wasn't improvising. She was building infrastructure. The renovation was never just a renovation. It was a financial instrument, a credible, documented, husband-approved system for moving marital funds to another person without triggering suspicion. Every legitimate invoice was a piece of camouflage. Think about what that requires. It requires planning. It requires a consistent internal narrative that justifies the deception. Something along the lines of, "I'm not stealing, I'm helping someone who needs it, and Daniel doesn't need to know." The self-justifying logic of someone who has separated their sense of integrity from the reality of their actions. Claire's professional precision, which Daniel had always admired, became the exact tool she used against him. The figure of Marcus is deliberately left incomplete, and that incompleteness is important. Daniel never confronts Marcus. Marcus never faces consequences. This is not a narrative failure. It's a psychological truth. In most real betrayals, the third party escapes the wreckage and continues intact, which is one of the most quietly enraging aspects of these situations. Daniel spends time angry about this, then less time, then accepts it. That progression from rage to resignation is not defeat. It's a realistic account of how adults process injustice that has no clean resolution. The chain reaction structure of the deception is worth noting. One lie required another. The initial transfers needed cover, which required a renovation, which required a budget, which required Daniel's trust, which required his continued inattention. Each layer was built on the stability of the previous one. When Daniel finally pulled the thread, the bank statement, the transaction history, the insurance contact, the whole architecture came apart quickly because it had never been load-bearing. It had only looked that way. What Daniel recovers in the end is not his marriage or his financial loss. He recovers his own perceptive capacity, the one he'd been professionally trained to use but personally chose to ignore. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have trusted the renovation budget without checking it? Would you have explained away the face-down phone? The most honest answer for most of us is probably yes. There's a broader truth underneath this story that goes beyond one marriage and one betrayal. We are taught, culturally, that trust is the opposite of suspicion, that to verify is somehow to accuse. Daniel internalized this completely. He didn't just trust Claire. He used trust as a reason not to look. And that distinction matters enormously. Real trust is active. It coexists with awareness, with questions, with the occasional gentle examination of things that seem slightly off. What Daniel practiced was something more like faith, belief maintained precisely because it requires no evidence. Claire, on the other hand, understood this about him. The financial architecture she constructed wasn't just clever, it was calibrated to Daniel specifically. She knew he respected her professional judgment. She knew he wouldn't scrutinize a budget she was managing. She knew which parts of their shared life he was willing to treat as someone else's department. That's the deeper wound, perhaps, not the money, not even Marcus. It's the realization that someone studied your blind spots carefully enough to use them. The accumulation effect is what ultimately broke through. Not one big mistake, but $7,000 spread across 6 transactions. One 9-year-old's offhand comment in a car. One green dress that appeared one morning and registered as wrong before Daniel could name why. Truth rarely arrives as a single explosion. More often it seeps in through the small gaps that gradually, quietly, become impossible to ignore. Daniel ends the story making chili from scratch, starting over deliberately from the beginning. It's a small act, but it carries the whole weight of the narrative. He's not pretending the house wasn't damaged. He's choosing carefully to build something real inside it anyway.